Hi, I'm Alan Rogers. Welcome to the Midweek Bible Study from New Salem Baptist Church. During the last big recession, back around 2008, a new phrase entered the American lexicon: too big to fail. The idea was that there were some banks and some industries that were so big and so important to the U.S. economy that the government had no choice but to step in and prop them up during the downturn, no matter what the cost. Sometimes we can make the mistake of believing that we're too big to fail. Individuals, groups, or even whole nations begin to believe their own press releases and act as if no one can touch them, maybe not even God. So it was with the Assyrian Empire in the 7th century BC. For centuries, the Assyrians had dominated their region, bullying, manipulating, and pillaging their neighbors. With their military and economic power, the Assyrians believed they were untouchable. Well, as the Jewish prophet Nahum preached in the mid-600s, God was about to show the Assyrians just how mistaken they were. But really, why should we care 2 continents away and nearly 2,700 years later? Well, one big reason is that the end of the Assyrian Empire reminds us that no one, no individual, no group, and no nation is ever really too big to fail in God's eyes. If we persist in sowing seeds of idolatry, immorality, and injustice, sooner or later, we're going to reap the deadly fruit we've sown. In the third and final chapter of his book, Nahum laid out in vivid detail exactly how God promised to take down the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. In a bit of poetic justice, the horror and humiliation that the Assyrians had inflicted on so many others would soon come back on their own heads. First, in verses 1 through 4, we see God promising to destroy the oppressors. Nahum's final message opens with the chilling words, "Woe to the bloody city, completely full of lies and pillage. Her prey never departs." Any sentence in the Bible that begins with woe, it's not good news, okay? Woe is the English translation of the Hebrew word hoy. Of the 53 times this word appears in the Old Testament, 41 of those occurrences are pronouncements of doom by the prophets. The rest of the time, the word is being used either in a funeral lament or in an exclamation of dismay. Now, in the New Testament, Jesus famously used the Greek version of this word to pronounce warnings to those who refuse to repent and receive his message, or to those who were wrapped up in religious legalism. Some food for thought there. Nineveh was doomed because of 3 major offenses against its neighbors. And Nahum lists those, first of all, as violence. He says it's the bloody city. And Assyrian brutality was legendary. In ancient accounts, tales abound of the Assyrian army leaving in its wake piles of bodies, stacks of skulls, prisoners of war impaled on stakes, and mutilated survivors missing limbs, ears, or noses. Now, any society that treats human life so cheaply couldn't hope to endure indefinitely. The second offense that Nahum lists as at the feet of Nineveh was the sin of deceit. He says the city is full of lies. When the Assyrians besieged a city, they often would send messengers who attempted to convince the populace to surrender in return for promises of peace and favorable treatment. We have a good example of that in the Bible, in the Assyrian envoy who visited to Jerusalem on behalf of the Assyrian king Sennacherib in 2 Kings chapter 18. The envoy, known as the Rabshakeh, encouraged the residents of Jerusalem to rebel against their king and to open their gates. He says, "Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me and come out to me, and eat each of his vine and each of his fig tree, and drink each of the waters of his cistern, until I come and take you to a land like your own land, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive trees and honey, that you may live and not die. But do not listen to Hezekiah when he misleads you, saying, the Lord will deliver us." Well, thankfully, the people of Jerusalem trusted in King Hezekiah and the Lord's deliverance more than they believed Assyrian promises, which usually turned out to be quite empty. Assyrian promises were often like a velvet glove covering an iron fist. In most cases, the cities who believed the Assyrians and surrendered would later find that the Assyrians interpreted those promises in ways that often benefited mainly the Assyrians. The third offense that Nahum lays against the Ninevites is the sin of pillage. The Assyrians built their empire either by taking by force or extorting by threat the wealth that belonged to their neighbors. Many of the residents of Nineveh lived quite comfortably on riches that were derived from the misery of the nations that Assyria conquered. But make no mistake, Nineveh's ill-gotten chickens were about to come home to roost. Nahum described the fate that awaited Nineveh in vivid detail. His description places the reader right in the middle of the action as the city of Nineveh falls to the invaders. In verses 2 and 3, he says, "The noise of the whip, the noise of the rattling of the wheel, galloping horses and bounding chariots, horsemen charging, swords flashing, spears gleaming, many slain, a mass of corpse, countless dead bodies. They stumble over the dead bodies." You can almost hear the rumble of the enemy chariots roaring down the city streets and the clashing of the sounds of spears and swords on shields. The bodies would be stacked so high, according to Nahum, that the combatants would stumble over them. The bloody horror that the Assyrians inflicted on so many others inevitably would be inflicted upon them. God stood against Nineveh because, in Nahum's words, it had seduced its neighbors like a prostitute. Nahum declared the reason this judgment had come upon the Ninevites in verse 4. All of this, all because of the many harlotries of the harlot, the charming one, the mistress of sorceries, who sells nations by her harlotries and families by her sorceries. Now, he's using that as a metaphor. Nineveh had used its military power, its diplomatic influence, and its economic dominance to seduce its neighbors. It seduced its neighbors politically, convincing them to come under Assyrian influence and control. It used its influence spiritually to encourage its victims to adopt Assyrian religion. And it also seduced its neighbors morally, quite literally in this sense, because a lot of the Assyrian religion involved practicing literal cult prostitution, as well as other detestable practices, including child sacrifice. Well, because of those offenses, God promised to humiliate the oppressors in verses 5 through 7. Nahum relays a threat from God himself to the Ninevites. "Behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will lift up your skirts over your face and show to the nations your nakedness and to the kingdoms your disgrace. I will throw filth on you and make you vile and set you up as a spectacle. And it will come about that all who see you will shrink from you and say, Nineveh is devastated. Who will grieve for her? Where will I seek comforters for you?" In this threat, God first reminds the Ninevites that all of their vaunted military might was worthless before the commander of heaven's armies. That's what the Lord of hosts means. Then God promised to humiliate the Ninevites by exposing their shame for all to see. Now, here's what's behind this image. In some ancient societies, women convicted of prostitution would be shamed publicly by having their clothes torn off and their nakedness exposed. That's exactly what God was threatening to do to the city of Nineveh in a metaphorical sense. Nineveh's skirts of invincibility would be torn off. All of her weaknesses and her shame would be revealed before the world. They no longer see this invincible nation, but they would see the true ugliness underneath. Even worse, God threatened to cover this formerly beautiful city in excrement and garbage to make her even more of a spectacle. Sadly, God predicted that no one would feel sorry for the Ninevites. "Who will grieve for her?" he says. "Where will I seek comforters for you?" Because of the pain and the suffering that the Ninevites had inflicted upon their neighbors, they could expect no sympathy or comfort. As Jesus would say later when warning his disciples about how they should treat other people, for in the way you judge, you shall be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. God promised to reveal the weakness of the oppressors. Decades of military dominance had convinced the Assyrians that they were invincible. Nahum pointed out just how vulnerable the Ninevites were by reminding them of a little recent history. He says, "Are you better than Nahum, which was situated by the waters of the Nile, with water surrounding her, whose rampart was the sea, whose wall consisted of the sea? Ethiopia was her might, and Egypt too, without limits. Put and Lubim were among her helpers. Nahum was one of the ancient names of the city of Thebes in Egypt. Thebes had once dominated Egypt the way that Nineveh dominated the Middle East. And the cities had a lot of similarities. Like Nineveh, Thebes was protected by formidable natural barriers, including where it was situated between the Nile River and the Red Sea. Like Nineveh, Thebes was surrounded by friendly allies like Egypt and Ethiopia, as well as friendly vassal states like Put, which is an ancient name for Libya, and Lubim, which we're not exactly sure, but possibly the area in what's now Somalia. The point is, people would have to go through those nations before they could even begin to get to Theban territory. Despite all of its power and advantages, Thebes had fallen. He goes on, yet she became an exile. She went into captivity. Also, her small children were dashed to pieces at the head of every street. They cast lots for her honorable men, and all of her great men were bound with fetters. Thebes' conquerors had inflicted brutal measures upon the once mighty city. Even small children were brutally murdered in the streets. Thebes' leaders were taken into custody and auctioned off as slaves. The story of Thebes' downfall should have been salient to the Ninevites, because the force that had conquered the mighty Egyptian city had actually been the Assyrians themselves, just about 50 years before Nahum preached. Now Nineveh itself would face a similar fate. He says to Nineveh, you too will become drunk. You will be hidden. You too will search for a refuge from the enemy. All your fortifications are fig trees with ripe fruits. When shaken, they fall into the eater's mouth. Behold, your people are women in your midst. The gates of your land are open wide to your enemies. Fire consumes your gate bars. Nahum warned that when the enemy appeared at Nineveh's gates, the Assyrian defense would be about as effective as a stumbling drunk. He warned there would be no escape, that the city of Nineveh was ripe for the picking. And when the attack came, the Assyrians' fierce reputation would melt away in hysterical panic. When our security is based on the wrong things, there's nothing like a crisis to show us just how defenseless we really are. Think of Jesus' parable about the man who built his house on the sand in Matthew 7, verses 25 and 27. He says, the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. What kind of foundation are you building your life on right now? What is your source of security? And is it something that's going to stand the storms of life? God promised to demonstrate the futility of resisting him in verses 14 through 19. Nahum called on the Ninevites to bolster their defenses the best they could. He says, draw for yourselves water for the siege. Strengthen your fortifications. Go into the city and tread the mortar. Take hold of the brick mold. In other words, build up those ramparts just as strong as you can. But in the end, the attempts to resist God's judgment would prove to be futile. In verse 15, he says, their fire will consume you. The sword will cut you down. It will consume you as the locust does. When the judgment came, Nineveh's wealth would be useless. Its soldiers would run away in panic. Its leaders would disappear, and its people will be scattered. Nahum goes on to say, multiply yourself like the creeping locust. Multiply yourself like the swarming locust. You've increased your traders more than the stars of heaven. The creeping locust strips and flies away. Your guardsmen are like the swarming locusts. Your marshals are like the hordes of grasshoppers, settling in the stone walls on a cold day. The sun rises, and they flee, and the place where they are is not known. Your shepherds are sleeping, O king of Assyria. Your nobles are lying down. Your people are scattered on the mountains, and there is no one to regather them. Now, there's also a positive note in a strange kind of way tucked into this oracle of woe. God promises to relieve the burden of the oppressed in verse 19. When the judgment came, Nineveh's power would be broken forever. There is no relief for your breakdown. Your wounds are incurable. But when Nineveh fell, all the nations who'd been brutalized by the Assyrians would celebrate. All who hear about you will clap their hands over you. For on whom has not your peril passed continually? Well, in 612 BC, just a few years after Nahum preached these messages, Nineveh was sacked and destroyed by the combined armies of the Medes and the Babylonians. Just as Nahum had predicted, the pain and suffering that the Assyrians had inflicted on so many came back to them in spades. Assyria never again rose to a position of prominence. Now, Nahum teaches us that while God's justice may be a long time in coming, it is inevitable. When we sow seeds of idolatry, immorality, and injustice, eventually we will reap a bitter harvest. No one is too big to fail. God will not be mocked. There's also some good news tucked away in Nahum's sermon for those who turn to God in humility and faith. Remember, the main audience for these messages was not actually the residents of Nineveh, but one of the people the Ninevites had been oppressing, Nahum's own people in Judah. God will not abandon his people. While God's people may face severe oppression, suffering, and even death, there's a day coming when God will step in and make everything right. The Bible gives this day many names. It's called the day of the Lord or the final judgment, so on. But the promise is clear. In the words of the prophet Joel, those who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. If you want to know more about what it means to call upon the name of the Lord, then reach out to me at pastor@newsalembaptist.net. Next time, Lord willing, we're going to begin a brand new study from a different book of the Bible. If you got any ideas, any suggestions, something you'd like to see, or maybe you got a question, feel free to send that to me on email or post it in the comments, and we'll take it into consideration. Keep watching our social media for info. And until then, keep walking in faith.